All right, hello everyone and welcome to our weekly 30-minute webinar. This is Matt with Variphy, and today I'm joined by Dan Schmidt, another SE over here. I'm quite certain most of you have heard his voice on here before, or at least previously worked with him already. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning, Matt. How's it going today?
Good, good. Okay, everyone. So before we get started, I would like to mention that we are currently looking for additional candidates to join our Verify Cloud EFT beta. We are currently in EFT 2, that's early field trials, version 2. So if you have any interest for our cloud offering, please let us know. You can contact beta@verify.com, cloud@verify.com, or your account manager or favorite systems engineer at your pleasure. Okay. So for today's webinar, we're going to focus configuring Verify for SAML SSO for Azure. Azure is a popular cloud-based SAML identity provider. This webinar will discuss the setup in both Azure IDP and Verify, the service provider, to enable SAML SSO authentication. Okay, we're going to get started with a quick overview of our company and what we do. We'll jump into a live demo where Dan will guide us through the Azure configuration within Verify, as well as the IDP. We'll pause for Q&A and get some of your questions answered. And during the demo, if you have any questions, make sure you ask them in the Q&A panel in the bottom right corner of the screen, not the chat panel, but the Q&A panel. And after the Q&A, we will reward one lucky attendee with a $50 Amazon gift card. So hang around and see if you have won. Okay, so a quick overview of Verify. Verify is the preferred analytics and management solution for Cisco Collab. We provide industry-leading CDR reporting and call analytics, customizable dashboards and widgets, UCCX reporting, remote phone control, change management, and DNDID. But today we're going to focus primarily on SAML SSO authentication for Azure. If you have any questions on any of our other content and features, we can certainly take those offline and get those answered for you. Okay, before we get started, we do want to announce that Verify now offers a newer service that provides managed consulting services to our customers and prospects. So Verify's SE team will be engaged on a one-on-one basis to remotely provide additional consulting, unassisted reporting, dashboarding configurations, and system monitoring resources, as well as additional training. This is a service that provides a dedicated Verify SE, like gentlemen like Dan or myself, to do all the heavy lifting of report creation and generation and all those tasks that you may not want to roll out to your team. So we can certainly handle all that for you. So for more information on that offering, please feel free to contact us and we can speak with you more further in depth about that. Okay, so now we're going to go into the wild. So Dan, I'm going to pass you the ball. You can go ahead and get us started.
All right, thanks a bunch, Matty Ice. Thanks everyone for joining us today on our weekly webinar series. Today we are going to be covering the integration with Azure AD to provide SAML or single sign-on access into the Verify application. So let me go ahead and share out my screen here. Today we'll be bouncing between two systems, the Azure portal from Microsoft and the instance of Verify that we'll be integrating with Azure. For those that may or may not have viewed our previous SSO with Okta session or have seen it on our website, the recording video, the process is going to be very similar. Some minor tweaks here and there. For the most part, though, just a couple fields that we'll need to copy out of Azure and basically paste into the Verify instance. Okay. So first, we're going to get started in the portal. So within the Azure portal here, we're going to jump right into the Enterprise Applications menu. So let this load up here. And within our Enterprise Applications, you can see that we've got a few other applications previously configured just to test this SSO. But today, we're going to show you basically every step of the way. So we're going to create a new application here. And that button is going to be up at the top. So new application. And at this menu, it's going to recommend some pre-configured cloud platforms and other applications that have been published to the Azure Marketplace. We're going to bypass all that. We do not have a published app in the Marketplace yet. So we're going to just create our own application. So there's this button in the upper left-hand corner for create our own application. And it's going to ask us, well, what do we want to name this new application that we're creating? So I'm just going to call it Azure Demo. Okay, and it's going to say, oh, we recommend a few of these other things because we typed in Azure, basically. So we're going to disregard that for now. And we want to make sure integrate any other application you don't find in the gallery or non-gallery. Okay, so we're going to create this. Okay, And as this loads up for us, the next screen should be, it'll take just a couple seconds here. The next setup screen is basically configuring the ins and outs for this specific application that we'll be using information from to populate fields within the Variphy application. Okay, so it sets us up with a very, very nice wizard. Just basically step through each option that we have here. So for our Azure demo application, we're going to first start off by assigning users and or groups to this application. So we want any user that will be using SSO within the Variphy system to also be, allowed access to authenticate through Azure AD. Okay, so we're going to click Add Users or Groups. In a normal running instance of Azure, you'd be able to assign the groups capability. We are running a free version of Azure, so that limits us to only named users. So I'm just going to select all of my named users here real quick. And we're going to select all those and assign them to this application. Okay. So step one of this process is completed. Okay. We're going to go back to the Azure demo application. And then the next step is to basically set it up. So associated entity IDs and ACS URLs and login URLs. By clicking this, it's going to say, well, what kind of application sign-on process are we using? Variphy is a SAML version 2 application. So that's how we handle our SSO. So we're just going to simply pick SAML here. And we got a series of steps in this second step here. Okay, so first thing we want to do is gather the basic SAML configuration. This is assuming that we already have started our configuration within Variphy. And I want to point out at the very top of this, we are also able to upload Variphy's metadata file. So that is the approach I'm going to take through this. You could very well just go in through each of these steps and copy in the URLs. But to keep it simple here, I'm going to jump over into Variphy and start building a new single sign-on configuration. You can see that I've got some previous configurations already configured. To keep it in the real world, I'm just going to actually go through it as if I were building it brand new. So I'm going to do add and then SAML. Okay. On the SAML configuration screen within Variphy, there is a lot to look at, but we're going to break this down very nicely so it's nice and easy for you. The first things first, the most basic is we're going to give this configuration, the SAML configuration, a name. So I'm just going to, this could be anything, just keep it simple here. I'm just going to name it Azure Demo. Okay. In most cloud-based SAML IDPs, we want to uncheck the strict. Okay. If we highlight over the question mark, it's basically saying that Variphy will reject unsigned or unencrypted messages if it expects them signed or encrypted. Most of these cloud IDPs do follow signed and encrypted transmissions, so we want to uncheck strict. Okay. Then we scroll down towards the middle of the screen here where we have two different sections. Everything on the left is the IDP, or in other words, this is the Azure side. Okay, this is the identity provider. And it's going to ask for a couple different things: the entity ID, the single sign-on URL, the certificate signing from the IDP. Now we're gonna grab all of this from Azure. But before we do that, we want to take a look at the service provider settings. So Variphy is the service provider in question here. And the first thing we want to do is give it an entity ID. And we want to take note of what we assign our entity ID here as. It's because we will be copying the same exact text into the Azure setup. This is case sensitive, so it must be an exact match. For me, my personal preference, I usually go with the host name of the server that Variphy is running off of. So I could just go HTTPS 10.0.0.9. And we want our communication to be secure. So we're going to use port 8443. And you'll see all the URLs, talking to the IDP and then the relay back to Variphy. Everything's going to be on 8443, the port 8443, to keep it secure. Okay. Now we could simply, in other identity providers, they will allow you to just type anything. You could type in a word. You could just type in the host name with nothing else. in Azure's case, I have found that if we're using the metadata file, which the next step here is we'll be extracting or downloading the metadata file. If we upload that metadata file into Azure, it appears that it always wants a HTTPS URL format of the information. So let me take that string again. Okay, and we're going to keep that as our entity ID. And now I'm going to copy this out and go back to my Azure configuration. Okay, so if I wanted to, right, again, you could hit edit in this first box, and on the top there, that's going to be your entity ID for the service provider. So I could simply paste that there if I wanted to and make that my default. Okay. Otherwise, we could just keep it nice and simple and just download the metadata file from Variphy. In order to do this, though, it's going to yell at you and say, well, you're missing a bunch of information that can, in case of Azure, it can be very easily, copied out of. Okay, so on every single application within Azure for SAML configuration, it's going to give you the setup information automatically, which is a very, very nice feature, right? You don't have to prolong the process by setting everything up. It's giving it to you right here, so you could paste that into the Variphy application. Okay, so there's two things that we are really worried about here: the login URL and the Azure AD identifier. Okay, the Azure AD identifier is basically the entity ID of the identity provider. So I'm going to simply copy this to my clipboard, go back to Variphy, and I'm going to copy that right there. We're going to jump back into Azure and the login URL. We're going to copy that to clipboard, and we're going to copy that directly into the single sign-on service URL. You should note that these random strings and digits, these are your org ID, I believe. For the service URL for Azure, in this case, it's always usually going to end with /SAML2. So that's your key identifier to make sure that that sign-on URL is correct. Okay. The next thing it's going to ask for is the X509 certificate signing. So this is the certificate signing from the identity provider. And again, it gives you a very nice, ability to basically download that certificate either in raw format or in metadata XML format. So what I normally do is I download both. I'll download the certificate base 64, and I'll also download the metadata XML. Okay. For this case, while we wait for that certificate signing to generate, at this point, we could go ahead and save our configuration within Variphy. Okay, so if I scroll down here, there are some other fields that we'll be noting in just a few minutes, but we're going to hold on that thought for now, and we're going to just save the setup for now so we could generate our metadata file. Okay, so we have our Azure demo single sign-on preference. In order to grab the metadata file, though, we do need to activate it. So I'm going to activate Azure demo, and then we indicate that it is active, and then we could go back in and edit it. And it now, if we take a look to the right side under our service provider settings, it does now give us a URL to grab our metadata file. Okay, so I'm actually going to just browse to this really quick. And so we have now two metadata files. We have the service provider or Variphy's metadata, which we could basically upload right into Azure, and it's going to take all the ACS URLs. It's going to take the entity ID. So in the case that you're copying and pasting, right, there's going to be smaller chance of maybe including a space or something in the URL. And then we also have the metadata file from the IDP itself, and its URLs to use. And we're going to need both. So I'm actually just going to open this file here. So show you what it looks like here. All right, so this is Variphy's metadata file, okay? And again, we could simply import this file into Azure, but there's a few things I want to point out before we do the import here. One is the location tag here. So this is the ACS URL. And within the Azure configuration, it will need to know what your service provider's assertion consumer service URL is. And so we have that sitting right here. Okay, it's basically the IP or the name of the server that you're enabling it on, /insight/SSO/SAML/ACS. Okay, so that's one thing that you could either just copy out and paste into Azure, or it'll automatically find it by itself when we import this file. The other thing that I want to point out is the entity ID, and that is going to be right there, entity ID, and that is what I associated to in the configuration of Variphy. Okay, so now that we have this file, I could simply close this file here, go back to Azure, and notice the upload metadata file option. I'm just going to upload this file here real quick. And there's my metadata file, and I'm going to click add. Okay, so it is auto-determined, the entity ID, the ACS URL, and there's really nothing else that we need to worry about here. Okay, let's see here. So I could already tell it's yelling at me already because there's already an entity ID with the same exact thing. So I could basically just say Azure demo. Okay, and we'll save that. And notice we want to go back to the service provider settings and we do Azure demo. Remember, this could be any string of text. Okay. Okay. The next part of this is to gather the metadata information from this IDP or Azure in this case. And I've got that file downloaded already. So let me show you what that looks like. And there's going to be a lot more information in this file, of course, a little bit hard to read, but the same things that we want to get out of this system, we need to paste into the configuration within Variphy. Okay, so first things first is the entity ID. On Azure, it's typically always going to be the same thing. The only thing that's different is your org ID, right? So I could basically just copy this link there. I've got it here already. Let's see here. Okay, we're going to jump back into Variphy, and we have it here already. Entity ID, the sign-on service URL. We copied it from the UI already, but this is just showing that, let me bring this back over here, that this information is the same. Okay, so up here on the top, we have the entity ID. On the bottom, again, we're looking for that sign-on URL tag, and then you're going to basically just copy the link out of there. Okay, so both of those. The one thing that we are missing, though, is the 509 signing, the certificate signing. So if I bring this up a little bit here, we got many instances within this one metadata file that has all of the same information. Okay, what I'm going to do here is look for, let's see, 509 data. Okay, here we go. So we got to copy all of this out, everything between the two tags, and just paste it simply into the box there. Make sure when you're copying and pasting, make sure that you're not maybe using a regular notepad editor. Sometimes it does add additional spaces in there and just regular copy paste functions. Okay. And the last thing that we want to look at is the attribute name for username. Basically what this is it's indicating what attribute, right, in the request, or sorry, in the response from the IDP, what attribute is actually being used to post the user ID that we're expecting on the service provider side. So obviously AD SAM account name, that is not going to be correct. That is more of an Active Directory attribute name. But within Azure, again, it's cloud-based. So everything is URL-based. In Azure, there's actually going to be, again, within all of this data, again, a lot to look at, not pretty, but there are URLs that begin with http://schemas.microsoft.com, identity provider, expiration. There's one called email, there's one called name. In my system, our names are or our sign-ons are email addresses, right? So we are going to take the email version of this attribute, which will happen to be schemas xmlsoap.org / this will be the same thing in every instance of Azure, but basically it's saying email address. Okay. Once we have that, we should be able to save our settings here. Again, this is already activated. So once we log out of this pane, it's going to want to do SSO activation or authentication rather. Okay. So really quick, I'm just going to copy my URL out here. I'm going to log out. And when you log out, right, you get a different screen that says, well, we're doing SSO. So click here to return to Variphy Insight because your credentials or whatever have been used have already been cached. So I'm actually just going to start a new private window. I'm going to browse to my application and it's bringing me to the Microsoft login, right? So this is pointing me to the application that we already built within Azure. And so I'm just going to do my login real quick. First time using this account, so it's gonna up. Okay. Doesn't like it's got some extra security. That's interesting. Okay. Okay, so working with SSO, right? This is live. I'll show you a trick that in many cases, right? Microsoft is very security conscious with reused passwords. It's seeing that, well, this account and that we're using and this password has been used too many times on other accounts. So let's see here. I'll just create demo. And if this doesn't work, I'll shoot my other one up here. So a quick tip, if your IDP is not allowing you in, basically, we have a bypass URL to use. Okay, so that's simply going to be the IP of your machine /insight/login.jsp. Now this is going to be the single sign-on bypass URL. Okay. Basically saying, hey, we're going to allow local authentication. Now, normally when we set up our service provider, it's going to ask you, do you want this account that you're using currently to be a SSO bypass account? And you're going to simply select yes as your local admin account. And just to show you here, I'm going to activate my old one because I know that works. Okay. And now copy the URL out again. And there we go. Okay. So basically it already had me authenticated with my account. I've previously set up one before this session. One thing to keep in mind, any users that you have configured on the IDP side will also need to be set up as local users here within the application. And that's simply because there's multiple layers of security within the Variphy application. So, if you're adding in additional users, you do want to still go to user accounts and groups. You could see the 2 accounts that I built, but anyone that needs access still needs to have a local account here. When we do this, you're going to notice that the password, right? It's not going to allow for a local account or local password. That's all handled by the IDP now. And so since we are signing in with email addresses, your user IDs will want to follow either the email address or however you set up the attribute name from your identity provider. In this case, we used email address, so your usernames must match here with what your IDP is responding back with. Okay, so that in a nutshell is IDP Azure single sign-on to Azure. So I know I went quite quick here. We've only got a few minutes left here. Matt, any questions that came through while I was presenting?
Yes. Awesome job, though, Dan. Stellar job as always. We do have a few questions from the audience here. Jeremy has a good one here. If we already have an Active Directory connection in Variphy and we have Azure sort of hybrid in our AD, should this be set up as well or instead of AD within Variphy?
It's a very good question. It's really on preference. If you have an Azure environment that is already synced with AD, I would always say, yeah, probably point it to the Azure side, right? Because that is what's performing authentication, and it's a lot more secure, right? Than it's an encrypted authentication process versus just logging in through Verify. And I think you said you have your Verify integrated with AD, but that's just local authentication. But yeah, it's just personal preference. There's an extra layer of encryption, I think, when we're doing SSO SAML, right? So.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you for that, Dan. Carrie has a good question. Does Verify support other SAML SSO? And actually, yes, we do. We do support the major identity providers. Okta, we actually did, as Dan mentioned, we did a webinar back on March 24th for that. So that's certainly in our libraries and our webinar page. ADFS, as well as Google sign-on, single sign-on as well.
Yeah, I'll add to that it should be any identity provider that offers SAML version 2. We've worked with other ones not listed as well, but yeah, just as long as it's SAML 2, it's just an open protocol. Yeah, but we've tested against the ones that Matt have said. Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you for clarifying that, Dan. Two more questions. One from Ahmed. Do we need to generate and load certs prior to SAML SSO?
Certs are not required for most cloud identity providers. So that would be Google, Okta, Azure AD. The only time that we see certs actually being needed if it's a domain-based IDP. So like your ADFS servers, that's a domain-based IDP. And then there's also another, if you have like maybe a homegrown, I've seen some that have homegrown SAML IDPs. There are certificates obviously required in that, but most cloud ones do not require, no.
Okay, awesome, thank you. And last question from Jason here. Does the 509 cert string need to be included at the beginning and end of cert in the IDP definition within Verify?
Excellent question. Verify will accept either or. So you can include the tags, the begin and end certificate tags, or you could just include the hash. We'll work with both of those.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I believe that's in the documentation for each of those, the Okta and the SAML Azure on the Verify website. Okay, all right, that is it for questions. Anyone else have any questions? If you want to sneak some in, go ahead and do so. If we don't get to them now, we will certainly answer them right after this call. Okay, but the moment everyone's been waiting for the prize, and the $50 Amazon gift card goes to, drum roll, Zachary Deere. Woo! Congratulations, Zachary. We will be in contact with your account manager to go ahead and get you paid. Okay, so thank you everyone for attending today's weekly webinar. Do want to make you aware of next week's webinar where Dre and myself will actually be showcasing how to migrate a Verify OVA, an older OVA, to our newer Linux Ubuntu OVAs. So feel free to go ahead and register for that. And lastly, I do want to plug, if you don't mind, on the verify.com website, we do have our webinar section, and we do have a suggestion option here for you. So if you have not seen any webinars to your liking or some specific ones that you would like to see, please feel free to go ahead and drop a suggestion in the bucket here for us. All right. Other than that, that is it from the Verify side. Thank you everyone for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks everyone. Be safe.
Take care. Bye-bye.